Today we're going to look at the topic Principles of Effective Writing. We're going to follow this outline. As objective for this module, we are going to have as objective by the end of this lesson to explain the effective writing, to explain why effective writing is essential in science, to identify core principle of effective scientific writing, to apply writing principles to improve clarity and flow, and evaluate and correct common writing mistakes in scientific documents. So as introduction, we are going to look at two main important questions. The first one is, what makes good writing? Good writing is characterized primarily by the fact that it communicates an idea clearly and effectively. This is the main characteristic of a good writing. It is characterized by the fact that it communicates an idea clearly. Secondarily, a good writing is characterized by the fact that it is elegant and stylish. Most of the times we focus on the second aspect or characteristic of good writing, which is making it elegant or stylish. But the most important aspect of good writing is that it must be clearly communicated. And what accounts for this clear communication is that it takes the writer to have something to say and to have a clear thinking about what he wants to communicate. And making your writing elegant or stylish basically constitutes or demands of you to take good time to revise and edit your work. Also, we will say that good writing is made up of three main components, which are clarity, conciseness, and coherence. These are the three main characteristics of what constitutes good writing. Your writing is good if it is clear, if it is concise, and if it is coherent. Now, secondly, what makes a good writer? A good writer is someone who clearly has something meaningful that he has to say. He has a logical and clear thinking about the thing that he wants to communicate. He masters a few simple and learnable rules of style, which we are going to look at in this lesson. He knows his audience and writes with that understanding of the audience in mind. And he's willing to revise and improve his first draft. The first draft is never perfect, but if you're willing to revise and improve on your first draft, you'll definitely be a good writer. A good writer is also someone who reads widely to observe good writing in action through other articles and write-ups by other authors, and practically regularly writing. So one thing we need to take home or understand is that good writing can be learned. It is something that can be learned. Moving to the next part of our lesson for today, is we're going to look at the significance of effective writing in the scientific context. Effective writing is very important because it enables our findings from our research to be communicated clearly to diverse audiences, thereby promoting collaboration and impact. Secondly, is that effective writing enhances credibility. When you write effectively and logically, when your writing is clear, it strengthens trust in your work. And lastly, effective writing facilitates learning and knowledge transfer to those who are reading whatever thing you have written. Now we're going to move on to the key principles of effective writing. The first key principle of effective writing is to follow the subject-verb-object, in bracket, or in other words, the active voice. There's what we call the active voice and the passive voice. The active voice is generally more effective and is what is recommended in scientific writing because it is direct and clear. The active voice basically is made up of the subject, the verb, and the object, or most of the times, the subject and the verb. The active voice clearly identifies who is doing what, making the sense easier to follow. Looking at this example, we have this sentence: the researchers conducted the experiment. It is an active voice because the subject in this example is the researchers. The researchers conducted, the verb conduct, and the object is the experiment. So the researchers conducted the experiment. This is an active voice. In the passive voice sentences, the subject is more or less acted upon. The subject doesn't act, he doesn't do the action. So the subject is acted upon. And usually a passive voice is made up of a passive verb, usually in the form, a form of the verb to be plus the past participle of the main verb. Usually a passive voice is made up of this passive verb, a form of the verb to be, which could be is, are, and so on and so forth, plus the past participle of the verb. Usually the verb used in the passive voice is usually a transitive verb, and it is structured as object, verb, subject, or just the object and the verb. If we look at this example, these are three statements of which are written in the passive voice. The first one, the data is analyzed. The data, the object here is the data. Is a form of the verb to be, and analyzed is the transitive verb, the past participle of the transitive verb. We have to take note that a transitive verb is a verb that requires a direct object to complete its meaning, meaning that standing alone, that verb doesn't make sense. If I say that he analyzed, if I end the sentence like that, you'll be tempted to ask, analyze what? So that analyze is a transitive verb because standing alone doesn't have a meaning. So you usually ask the question in front of a transitive verb of what or whom after the verb. So here we have the report was written. The report is the object. Was is a form of the verb to be, and written is the past participle of the transitive verb. The same with the last sentence. The patient object was a form of the verb to be, and examined, which is the past participle of a transitive verb. So this is a sentence written in the passive voice. We have to take note that to turn a passive voice back to the active voice, the simple question we should ask ourselves is, who does what to whom? And that literally answers the question of it literally sets the sentence from the passive voice back to the active voice. Ask yourself the question, who does what? One of the myths that is known is that passive voice is more objective. On the other hand, it is not more objective. A passive voice is more vague. That is why it is recommended to use the active voice in scientific writing, because the active voice is direct, it is natural, it is informative, it is straight to the point. So this is an example of sentences which are written in the passive and in the active form. The first one, to study DNA repair mechanics, this study on hamster cell DNA was carried out. When you read this sentence, you discover that this is not more objective. It's a little bit confusing. But when you put it in the active form and say, to study DNA repair mechanics, we carried out this study on the hamster cell DNA. Discover that everything changes. The second one is more objective. It is more clear compared to the passive form of the verb, of the voice. So this is just an example to illustrate the passive form and the active form. We have to note that, however, given that this is a rule in scientific writing, sometimes it is appropriate to use the passive voice. When do we use the passive voice? Firstly, we use the passive voice when the action of the sentence is more important than who did it. for example, when describing materials and methods in your research, the method used is usually more important than who did the action. For example, in this sentence, 3 liters of fluid is filtered through porous glass beads. This is a passive voice. And in this voice, it is best placed like this because the action, which is what we want to know in this case, is the process, which is filtration. We don't necessarily need to know who filtered the liters of water. The information that we need clearly from here is what process was carried out. Secondly, we will use the passive voice if we want to emphasize someone or something other than the agent that performed the action. For example, this sentence, the Clintons were honored at the banquet. When you're making your sentence and you say the Clintons were honored at the banquet, in other words, you're trying to communicate to us that it is important who received the action. So in this case, the passive voice is accurate to use. Thirdly, when the subject is unknown, we have to use the passive voice. For example, in this sentence, the professor was assaulted in the hallways. We do not know who was the predator of the crime. We don't know who assaulted the professor, but the information that is passed across in this sentence is that the professor was assaulted. So when the subject is unknown, the passive voice can be used. Moving to the next key principle is avoid subject-verb separation. In scientific writing, to improve clarity, the subject and the verb must be close together as possible. Long gaps between the subject and the verbs can confuse readers, especially when you report technical and multidisciplinary contexts. Keeping them close helps readers to identify who or what is performing the action. So this is a key principle in effective writing. We're going to look at an example. In this first sentence, DNA found in body fluids, blood, saliva, urine, and semen, soft tissues, bone, teeth, nails, hair roots, and hair shafts contains genetic code. It is unclear. But if you rather say DNA contains genetic code and is found in body fluids, soft tissues, bone, teeth, nails, and hair shafts, it is clearer. Okay. Contains is the verb. The subject is DNA. In the first example, DNA is at the start of the sentence and the verb is at the end, and in between the two, there's a lot of information that confuses the reader, and the reader finds it difficult to clearly understand what is being communicated. But if you close the gap between the subject and the verb, as in this case, DNA, the subject, and the verb contains, discover that it is clearer to understand. Thirdly, the key principle in effective writing is to use strong verbs and avoid turning verbs into nouns. A sentence usually uses one main verb to convey its central action. Without that verb, the sentence will not make sense. So in every sentence, there is what we call the action verb or the main verb. That main verb is the verb that reflects the action that is being chosen to describe and to help bring the reader into what we are trying to narrate. The use of dull and lifeless verbs slow down sentence, slow down the reading of the person who reads your work. It is important that we don't kill verbs and adjectives by turning them into nouns. Okay, so we have to remove from our sentences the use of the verb to be as much as possible. Examples or forms of the verb to be is, are, was, were, be, been. Those are forms of the verb to be. The more these verbs are in a sentence, they make the sentence long and quite boring. So as example, this first example is to illustrate the use of strong verbs in a sentence. Loud music came from speakers embedded in the walls, and the entire arena moved as the hungry crowd got to its feet. When you compare it with the second sentence, loud music exploded from speakers embedded in the walls, and the entire arena shook as the hungry crowd leaped to its feet. You discover that in the second example, it is clearer to understand because the reader placed action verbs in his sentence that made the sentence to be clearer. So use action verbs, strong verbs to convey the message that you want to convey in your sentences. Another example, which is avoiding to turn verbs into nouns, is example number 2 here. The sentence, there was a long line of bacteria on the plate. Long line is a noun. Long is an adjective, actually, and line is a noun in this sentence. But you discover that if we rewrite it and stop using that verb as a line and bringing it back to its initial state as a verb, discover that we have shortened the sentence to be bacteria lined the plate. As simple as that. So avoid turning verbs into nouns and use strong verbs in your writing. So here are some examples of how we usually employ nouns into our sentences, and we can rather use the verbs of those nouns to shorten our writing and make our sentences clearer. For example, has seen an expansion in can simply be reduced to say has expanded. If you say provides a methodological emphasis, emphasis becomes a noun. But if you say emphasizes methodology, it makes it simple. Take an assessment of. If you just say assess, it is easy and clearer. Provide a review, rather use review. Offer confirmation of, you could rather you say confirm. Make a decision, decision is a noun. Decide, rather use decide. Show it, pick, rather use picks. So these are a few examples of what not to use and what we could instead use in this case. The fourth key principle that we're going to look at is eliminate negatives and use positive constructions instead. Positive statements are clearer over negative ones. When we use positive constructions, it improves the clarity, reduces ambiguity, and makes sentences easier to read and understand. So every sentence can be written in the negative form or the positive form of the sentence. For example, the first sentence that we have here, he was not often on time, is the negative form, which is to be avoided. You could better say he usually came late. It's easy, and the clarity in this sentence is better compared to the previous one. If we look at the other example, she did not think that studying writing was a sensible use of one's time. You could better say, she thought studying writing was a waste of time. So the first one in red is the negative form. The one in blue is the positive form. So eliminate negatives and use positive constructions instead. So here are some examples of negatives and their corresponding positive constructions. Instead of saying not honest, just say dishonest. Instead of saying not important, you could use the word trifling. Instead of saying does not have, rather use lack. Did not remember, forgot, did not pay attention to, rather use ignored. Did not have much confidence. You could rather say distrusted. did not succeed, or rather say failed. So these are positive constructions. You discover that when using the positive constructs, it makes your sentence shorter, it makes it clearer, and it makes your work less difficult to read and understand. Moving on to the next key principle of effective writing, reduce deadweight words and phrases. As I was saying, deadweight words are words which adds no additional meaning to your sentence, and if removed, ensures more conciseness and clarity. I'll take the example of the sentence below. I would like to assert that the author should be considered to be a buffon. This is a long sentence which can just be summarized to the author is a buffon. So all the sentence, the long sentence of I would like to assert that the author should be considered to be a buffon is very long. There are a lot of dead sentences inside, which could just be summarized to the author is a buffon. So it's important to hunt down and cast out all unneeded words that might slow your reader. Words like very, really, quite, basically, generally are seldom useful in sentences. So as much as possible, remove the sentence, these words from your sentence and see if it improves your sentence or not. As I earlier said, watch out for the verb to be. Often the are is extra weight. They are in quotes is extra weight in sentences. For example, there are many students who like writing. You could better say many students like writing. It is simpler, it is shorter. Some deadweight words or clunky phrases are what we have here. All of the three is equivalent to the three. Few in number could just be said fewer. Give rise to is synonymous to cause. In all cases, will be replaced with always. In a position to can best be used as can. If you say, for example, the president of the republic is in a position to, I don't know, to appoint a minister, you could better say that the president of the republic can appoint a minister. It's as simple as that. In close proximity to can be better said near. In order to can just be summarized and used as to. Some words also, like in spite of the fact that, can be used as although. In the event that, can be replaced with if. New innovations can just be said innovations. One are the same, is the same. Period of 4 days, better use 4 days because period and 4 days is a repetition in itself. Personal opinion because an opinion is personal. So using personal and opinion is already a repetition. Shorter in length is also a repetition because short and length go together. Better use either shorter or longer. So with this principle of reducing dead weights and phrases, it is important to be vigilant because in your initial draft, there will always be extra words that always creep in unnoticed. And when reviewing your work, it is important to ask yourself, is this word or phrase necessary? What happens if I remove it? Test it by removing them and seeing if the meaning of your sentence or whatever you want to pass across remains unchanged. If it does remain unchanged, you can get it out. The next key principle which we are going to look at is to use transition markers appropriately. Transition markers. Transition markers are words which are used to transition from one sentence to another or one paragraph to another. Firstly, we use transition markers to indicate cause and effect. So if you want to indicate cause and effect in your sentences, use therefore, thus, accordingly, consequently. These are words, synonyms of the same word that you can use to indicate cause and effect. For example, the patient was an adopted child. Therefore, the genetic data were not collected from his family. So this is a cause and effect. So the second one is a consequence of the previous sentence. So therefore goes in this case. The second example, adding ammonia to eluene significantly increased ionization of saccharides. Thus, we concluded that this method was effective. So these are examples where you use these transition markers to indicate cause and effect. We have to note that thus can also be used to replace or to say in this way, whereas so can be used in academic writing, but then it is considered informal to start a sentence with so. It is informal in scientific writing to start a sentence with so. Transition markers can be used appropriately to introduce new information that adds to or support what you have previously said. You can use the words further, furthermore, additionally, in addition, or moreover. An example is as follows. Engineers should focus on improving the whole life cycle performance of structures. Furthermore, they should attempt to maximize the flexibility of any structural design. Discover that the next sentence is an addition, it supports the previous statement. So in this case, you can use furthermore, you can use further, you can use additionally, in addition, or moreover. We have to note here that using an at the start of a sentence is considered informal in academic writing. And when you want to enumerate a list of items, it is preferable to use markers such as first, second, third, and finally. This is to allow your reader to know when the list has started and when it has ended, and when a new argument has begun. This is very important for clarity in your write-up. Also, transition markers can be used to introduce information that contrasts what has been previously said. You can use the word however, nevertheless, nonetheless, in contrast. For example, the statement, our results provide strong support for an association between prenatal exposure to marijuana and hyperactivity in early childhood. Nevertheless, this association should be tested in large-scale population-based studies. Okay, so here we are seeing that there's a contrast between the first statement and the second. What to note here is that but can be used at the start of a sentence, but it is considered informal in academic writing. And we should use in contrast only when there is a significant or a direct contrast or difference between the two statements that are being used in your write-up. The seventh key principle that we are going to look at is parallelism. We have to ensure parallelism. Parallelism is the use of equivalent grammatical elements and matching sentence structures to express equivalent ideas. Parallelism is to ensure continuity and equivalent expression of ideas and structures in your sentences. There are three main cases where this applies. Items in a series. For example, the statement, complete blood counts revealed anemia, in bracket hemoglobin equals to 5.9 grams per deciliters, leukocytosis, we have the white blood count, and a platelet count of this. You discover that in this sentence, it is not parallel. We begin with anemia, and in bracket, we have the equivalent hemoglobin value. We have leukocytosis, and we have the white blood cell count with its value. And the last statement is not following the chronology that was used in the first two instances. So a correct way to write this will be complete blood count revealed anemia in bracket hemoglobin, and you put your value, leukocytosis in bracket and you put the value, and the next one thrombocytopenia, and you do the same as the previous one. So this is parallelism. So ensure parallelism when enumerating items in a series. Also, we can use parallelism when writing patterns. For example, the statement, the study aims to evaluate effectiveness, measuring outcomes, and how patients responded is not parallel. The pattern is discontinued, is disconnected. The first one said evaluate effectiveness. Second one, measuring outcomes. The third is how patients responded. It's not parallel. The correct way to say it is the study aims to evaluate effectiveness, measure outcome, and assess patient responses. You have to know that in this example, the verb was accompanied by the subject, the object, sorry. To evaluate effectiveness, to measure outcome, and to assess patient responses. So the pattern was respected throughout, and that is parallelism. So ensure parallelism in patterns. Another example is the intervention was safe, affordable, and offered convenience. This is not parallel. It's an incorrect statement. The right way to put it is the intervention was safe, affordable, and convenient. When writing lists and outlining things, parallelism should also be ensured. For example, the proposal covers community engagement strategies, how we will monitor the program, and funding allocation. This is not parallel. A better way to say it is the proposal covers community engagement strategies, program monitoring methods, and funding allocation. Discover that we have ensured parallelism in the things that in the list that we have enumerated. It is important that in reviewing your work, you avoid faulty parallelism. Make sure that the parallel items are in the same grammatical form. Avoid shifts in voice within the same sentence, especially if the subject is the same. So avoid shift in voices, be it the active voice you use in the same sentence or paragraph, you are using the active voice and the passive voice. You have to avoid that. For example, we developed a controller for a fleet of unmanned aerial vehicles, and the proposal was validated through simulation of various scenarios. We discovered that the first portion of our sentence, we developed, this is active. We, subject, develop, object, a controller. We, subject, develop, verb, and controller, object is active. And we are combining it with a passive voice, which is wrong. So the correct way to say it is, we developed a controller for a fleet of unmanned aerial vehicles and validated the proposal through simulation of various scenarios. So discover that the first and the second portions of this sentence are both in the active form. Another way we could still write this sentence is to put both of them in the passive form, as we are seeing in this other part of the example. We should avoid, in ensuring parallelism, we should avoid shifts in tense within a sentence. If we are beginning a sentence in the present tense, we have to make sure that we are consistent to make the sentences parallel. For example, the patient is unable to give informed consent as he had severe developmental disabilities. The first part of this sentence, the patient is, that is present tense, unable to give informed consent. And we are associating it with another sentence, which is in the past tense, as he had severe developmental disabilities. That is the past tense. This is not parallel. The correct way to say is the patient was unable to give informed consent as he had severe developmental disabilities. The first part of this sentence is in the past tense. The second part is in the past tense. That is parallel. Or we could make both parts in the present tense. The patient is unable to give informed consent as he had severe developmental disabilities. So the patient is present as he has is present. The next one, avoid shifts in person and number within a sentence. If you're writing your sentences, ensure that you maintain either the singularity or the plurality in the numbers or the persons being used in the sentence. For example, this sentence, high-performing employees tend to prefer job autonomy, whereas a high-performing manager tends to prefer job satisfaction. The first one, high-performing employees. High-performing employees is plural, and in this sentence is associated with a high-performing manager. We discovered that we have the plural and the singular. This is not parallel. The correct way to say it is high-performing employees tend to prefer job autonomy, whereas high-performing managers, plural, tend to prefer job satisfaction. Or we could use the singular in both cases. A high-performing employee tends to prefer job autonomy, whereas a high-performing manager tends to prefer job satisfaction. The next key principle that we are going to see of effective writing is to describe comparisons correctly. Comparisons are important in scientific writing, and we have to ensure that our comparisons are clear and precise. Misleading comparisons can confuse readers, and common errors that can be used is the lack of clarity in what is being compared and the use of victims without context. And here are some examples of common errors that we usually do when comparing sentences. There's what we call incomplete comparison. It's a comparison that is done between two things, but sometimes the reader is untold what is being compared to what. For example, in this sentence, at baseline, our participants had higher serum creatinine levels, and this is the potential limitation of our study. In this example, we are comparing our participants to something that is not mentioned in this sentence. It says at baseline, our participants had higher serum creatinine levels compared to what it is not mentioned. And this is, the statement continues by saying, and this is a potential limitation of our study. So it is an incomplete comparison. A correct way of saying this phrase is, at baseline, our participants had higher serum creatinine levels than the general population, and this is a potential limitation of our study. There's also what we call illogical comparisons, where two things are being compared, but are not logically comparable to one another. For example, the values from the first experiment were higher than the second experiment. This statement may sound correct, but it's not correct because we cannot compare values and experiment. The statement says the values from the first experiment were higher than the second experiment. So logically, in this sentence, we are comparing values and experiment, which is not logical. The right way to say is that the values from this experiment were higher than those from the second experiment. So in this case, it is clear that we are comparing the values from the first experiment to those of the second experiment. The third form of wrong misuse of comparisons is unclear comparisons, where the reader may find it confusing to decide which two things are being compared. For example, students preferred wearable devices more than teachers. Students preferred wearable devices more than teachers. In this sentence, it may sound correct, but the information that we get from here is that students preferred devices to teachers, which is unclear. So we don't know if the students are given the choice to prefer between wearable devices or the teachers. A better way to say it is that students prefer wearable devices more than teachers did. So just this did that has been added to this sentence make the sentence clearer to tell us that the comparison is between the wearable devices preferred by students to those of the teachers. There are extra comparisons. Extra comparisons is the use of more than one comparative word in a sentence. We need just one comparative word in a sentence when making comparisons. For example, the statement saturated monocyclic hydrocarbons decomposed more faster than unsaturated monocyclic hydrocarbons. More faster in this sentence is a combination of two comparative words, more and faster. More is a comparative word, faster is a comparative word. When the two are present, is a misuse of comparative words. The correct thing to do is to use just one of them. Saturated monocyclic hydrocarbons decomposed faster than unsaturated monocyclic hydrocarbons. The next is the comparison of compared to versus compared with. Compared to is used when we want to focus on the similarities between two compared objects, while compared with is used when we want to focus on the differences. For example, the immune response in this study can be compared to a well-trained army, fast and specific. In this statement, obviously, the message we get is we are trying to compare and make the immune system in the study similar to that of a well-trained army. But in the other sentence, the results of this trial were compared with previous findings to assess improvement. Compared with in this statement talks about differences. So we use compared to when we want to focus on similarities and compared with when we want to talk of differences. So in conclusion, complex ideas don't require complex language. Scientific writing should be easy and enjoyable to read. Good writing should be clear, concise, and coherent. This brings us to the end of our lessons. These are the references that we used for our study. Thank you very much.